Thank you, John, and thanks to all of you for your interest in this webinar on Keystone Research Center's new report about Giant Eagle. The report I will walk you through today is about an opportunity to restore a partnership between Giant Eagle, its workers, and its community, broadening Pittsburgh's new prosperity to the benefit of all parties. Along with this webinar, another resource available to you is the Facebook Live video of the press conference held February 28th. Um, that resource is available on the same page as our report and also on our Facebook page. That video includes workers and community members speaking out in support of the need for a new partnership between Giant Eagle, its workers, and its community. For the first half of the company's existence since its founding more than 80 years ago, such a partnership between company workers and the community existed. This presentation will explain why we need to get back to that kind of partnership. Next slide, please. This slide summarizes the main points of my presentation. So first, many Giant Eagle workers today earn too little to support a family, and that imposes costs not just on workers but also on taxpayers. Second key point is the company has grown enormously. It's now a $9.3 billion company, um, and it's highly profitable thanks to productivity gains and the new 2017 federal tax law. A third point is that Giant Eagle now receives low customer as well as worker ratings and has lost some market share. So there are warning signs that the current direction won't work forever, even for the company. And the last point is that to live up to its community reputation and for its own enlightened self-interest, Giant Eagle should seek to restore the partnership that it had some decades ago with its workers and with its home community. Next slide, please. This slide provides a bit of the larger context for this report. The first point is that the food industry is really too big to remain low wage. Sometimes people will look at the food industry, grocery stores, and also fast food. That can be for teenagers. It can be a starter job. But the fact is that there are just simply too many jobs in this sector. If we don't have many of those jobs, middle-class jobs, that's a problem for workers and the community. There are nearly 800,000 Pennsylvanians working in the food industry. That's 40% more than in the manufacturing sector, 60% more than in the so-called eds or education sector, and not far off as many as in the meds or giant healthcare sector. More than 250,000 Pennsylvanians work in food stores, so that broadening Pittsburgh's new prosperity requires creating more family supporting jobs in big service industries such as the food industry, such as retail food and grocery stores. When it comes to grocery stores, Giant Eagle is the dominant player in the Pittsburgh region, so improving the jobs in this large sector in the region begins with improving them at the largest player in the region, Giant Eagle. Next slide, please. So here's the data on the Giant Eagle market share. It's very substantial. It grew a lot, partly because Kroger left the region in the 1980s, and Giant Eagle picked up a lot of that market share. Even though it's come down some, Giant Eagle still has a third of the market. So that's enough of a share to be a really powerful player when it comes to setting wages and benefits in this sector. Next slide, please. Here's an elaboration of one of the points I made up front, that Giant Eagle had a partnership with its workers and community before 1980. In that period, the company had middle class jobs that paid in today's dollars anywhere from $15 an hour to as close to $30 an hour for meat cutters. These were jobs that were sought after in the community and hard to get. And that's based on interviews with some of the longest serving Giant Eagle workers. The company had good relationships with its workers. Saul Shapiro, the CEO, until 1981, is remembered very fondly by those longtime Giant Eagle workers, and it had a well-deserved reputation. Giant Eagle did as a pillar of the community. Next slide, please. But the situation has changed, and the partnership between Giant Eagle and its workers and community has frayed a lot since 1980. The changes started outside the food retail industry. There was big concession bargaining in auto industries, starting at Chrysler and then Ford and General Motors. Um, and then that concession bargaining spread to other sectors, including the retail grocery sector, even though in that sector there's no threat from competition outside the region in low wage states or countries, because retail grocery stores have to operate uh, in the same place as their customers. Um, the Another key step in Giant Eagle stepping away from its historic partnership was it bought a wholesaler in the early 1980s and opened some non-union franchise stores. Um, this positioned the company, and this is laid out clearly in the company history, to take a strike and be able to continue operating to some extent. The company did take a strike in 1983, as the quote from the CEO at the time, Saul Shapiro's son, indicates. The company was asking for giant cuts in wages. Wasn't necessarily something the company, at least explicitly, said it wanted to do, but that's what it did demand. And so we'll see in the next slide that entry level wages were cut in half in the early 1980s, and basically haven't recovered since. So what you see here is the green line is uh, the wage for entry level meat cutters, nearly $30 an hour in the early 1980s, and then $15 an hour and less since then. The mostly yellow and lighter green line is a combination of stock clerks and cashiers. Um, and you see that those two occupations, which were separate at one point, but then um, in the last decade or two, 25 years, have had basically the same starting wage, went from about either 15 or $20 an hour in the 80s, 70s and early 80s, down to 8.45 currently, and between 7 and 8 for most of the past 30 years. The red line, just as a point of reference, is the median wage for all full-time, full-year Pennsylvania workers. What you see there is that that hasn't gone up a lot. Workers across the board haven't done very well in the last nearly 4 decades now. But Giant Eagle wages went from near or well above that red line to being order of magnitude half the Pennsylvania median wage. That really is a stunning relative decline in a country and a state where wages across the board have been pretty stagnant. Next slide, please. This slide shows you um, uh, that grocery workers' wages across the board in Pennsylvania, that's the yellow line at the bottom, have actually declined slightly since 1980. But you don't see the kind of decline you had at Giant Eagle. Part of that is because Giant Eagle started well above the industry median, and now, if anything, is below it. Next slide, please. So So far, we're giving you facts and figures. As the workers, who spoke out at our press conference indicated, low wages have a real human and community cost. Workers, as they eloquently explained, and there are some quotes from workers and some stories of the kinds of struggles workers have in our report. But when you're making nine, $10, $11 an hour, sometimes working part time as well, it's hard to pay your bills. Giant Eagle actually recognized this to some extent a few years ago when it created kind of a team member care fund, and it takes contributions from workers to help cover the basic needs of workers who aren't able to get by. So, utility payments, rent payments, other expenses. Um, but I mean, that is a clear demonstration of the fact that lots of workers are struggling to pay a bare bones family budget. Um, Another piece of evidence to that effect is a lot of Giant Eagle workers are on public assistance, getting health care for low income people and families through Medicaid, or getting food assistance through the Supplementary Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP. Um, and and if you add up the reduction in total pay across the company because of given the size of the company's workforce and given the cuts in wages since the 1970s, that total reduction in wage payments is many, many times, as many as 100 times the documented philanthropic contributions of Giant Eagle's foundations in its two main states of Pennsylvania and Ohio. Next slide, please. This slide shows further um, that um, uh, a big share of Giant Eagle workers, nearly half overall, that's the 46% in the middle of this chart, earn what is called a poverty wage. This is defined as a wage below the poverty line for a family of four if someone works full time, full year. So that's $24,600. Um, you see on the far right that workers hired in the last decade or so, over two-thirds of them make below a poverty wage, um, and almost two-thirds of the part-time workers earn a poverty wage. These are conservative estimates because, again, as we pointed out, most Giant Eagle workers don't work full-time, full year. Bottom line, they're not getting enough uh, income to support their family from their Giant Eagle job. Next slide, please. So this um, chart shows the details in terms of Pennsylvanians on public assistance, two of the main kinds of public assistance, Medicaid and food assistance, or SNAP. This shows six major chains that sell groceries, including discount chains that sell groceries. What you see is that Giant Eagle is third in terms of the total number of people who are on either, that is, the total number of Pennsylvania employees at Giant Eagle who are on Medicaid, on SNAP, or on both programs. So Walmart and Sam's Club top the tables here with nearly 9,000 of their workers receiving this public assistance. Ahold, which owns two other supermarket chains, Giant in the middle part of the state, Giant of Carlisle, and then Martin's, that's about 4,500 people, and then Giant Eagle is third with 3,605 of its employees on one or both kinds of public assistance. Just as one point of comparison, that's 40 times as many employees as Costco, which, as many of you will know, has a reputation for providing good jobs to its employees, jobs that do support a family and mean that most of their workers are not on public assistance. Next slide, please, John. Okay. Our report also documents a series of changes since 2014. Um, the company has been cutting staff significantly. Some of this may be because part-time workers who leave are not being replaced in all cases. The company gained additional rights to reassign full-time workers to wherever they're needed in the 2014 union contract. So it may be that that reassignment flexibility has contributed to the company being able to not replace uh, part-time workers. Based on our assumptions, it looks like, given sales trends and the cuts in the workforce, productivity at the company of its hourly workers seems to have increased about 20 or 25% since 2014. In interviews, workers say that they and their managers are very short-staffed. Next slide, please. So what this bar chart shows is the staffing reductions in four categories. It's full-time and part-time, and then separately for the grocery workers covered by the company's corporate contract, and then for the meat workers also covered by the corporate contract for meat and deli workers. And what you see is the two bars to the right. The part-time employees in both those departments have seen much bigger drop-offs. The full-time workers have seen smaller ones. That's why our hypothesis is that partly what's going on is that they're not replacing all the part-time workers. Next slide, please. The wage trends here actually show an increase in part-time workers. That also fits with the idea that those part-time workers aren't being replaced because the lowest wage part-time workers are the new ones. And so if they're not hiring as many new ones, the seniority of the smaller part-time complement is going to be greater, and the wages, as you see, have gone up. The wages for full-time workers basically are unchanged. Next slide, please. So we've told a story so far of low wages that don't support a family and a predominantly part-time workforce, nearly two-thirds, and also in recent years a story of uh, cutting staff and workers feeling that their intensity of work has increased to some extent. So um, one of the consequences of that combination is very high turnover rates among newer employees. So you see the bar on the left, the turnover rate among people in their first year is basically 100%. Um, in the second and third year, it drops to 40%, and then in people who stay with the company for at least 3 years are likely to stay for quite a long time. Obviously, the proportion of full-time workers increases substantially as you move out to the right. By 20 plus years, most of the workers there are full-time. Next slide, please. So uh, the basic information so far is that Giant Eagle has grown enormously. There's a bit more detail on that in the report. It is has revenues now annually that make it the 31st largest privately held company in the United States. And then in recent years, you've got the staffing cuts, and you also have the federal tax reform. So, based on the available evidence, um, Giant Eagle so far seems to be doing very well with the strategies it's implemented over the past 40 years. Next slide, please. But the question our report raises is whether this approach is going to continue to work well for the company. Clearly, it's not working very well for workers or for taxpayers in the community um, who have to help pay the cost of the public benefits received by a significant part of Giant Eagle workers. But from the company's point of view, there are some warning signs. One is market share since 1997 is down uh, from 43% to about a third. Second warning sign is Walmart Sam's Club has gradually crept up to a quarter of the market. Basically, wasn't a presence in the area in 1990, but now is a quarter of the market. Another warning sign is there are three sort of chains that are either high end or have a reputation for good quality and service that have increased their market share by 6 percentage points since 2010. So you're getting this kind of pincer movement and segmentation of the market with companies taking some market share from Giant Eagle from low cost discount chains, and then on uh, the high end from higher quality, higher service chains. And then here comes Amazon and Whole Foods. The last warning sign here, if you give us the next slide, John, we'll go into it in more detail, is the low consumer ratings and worker ratings that Giant Eagle now receives. So this chart summarizes data from two different online sources. Um, one's actually Consumer Reports is not online, but one Consumer Reports survey, and then from a second customer satisfaction index. So as you can see from this, Giant Eagle is pretty close to Walmart, better than Walmart, but much closer to Walmart than Trader Joe's, Wegmans, Costco at the right hand of this uh, chart showing customer ratings. Next slide, please. And then there are a couple different online sources where workers rate their employer. One's called Glassdoor, the other is Indeed.com. And again, you get the same basic picture as the customer satisfaction ratings. Giant Eagle is towards the bottom uh, and a good distance from Costco on the right hand side. Next slide, please. So those warning signs again are why we think it makes sense for the company as well as for the other stakeholders in Giant Eagle to step back from the current strategy and um, uh, think about restoring the kind of partnership that exists in the past. Uh, this slide shows another set of reasons why that makes sense. Um, uh, the basic point here is that a so-called good job strategy, strategies in which workers partner with their employer to deliver good service and efficiency. Um, that's a well-trodden path in this food retail industry. You've got very well-known names like Costco, but you also have Trader Joe's, which demonstrate the viability of a good job strategy. There's more detail on that kind of strategy in the report, a reference to a relatively recent book called The Good Job Strategy, which drills down into four different retail food companies, including those two, Trader Joe's and Costco, and kind of shows how the combination of good jobs and flexible deployment of staff and other operating practices come together in a formula that works well for workers, but also works very well for the companies and for their customers. There are some other reasons that we think Giant Eagle can still reposition itself and restore that historic partnership. It is a company with a great community reputation and still has a reservoir of goodwill because of that and because it's a hometown company. Um, Philanthropy in the region has been very concerned with how Pittsburgh Pittsburgh's new prosperity can be shared more broadly, and philanthropy, regional political leaders, and Governor Wolf would all welcome and support this kind of shift. There is some evidence in our report that the company's current CEO actually, uh, in her gut, has a feel that the kind of partnership that her, I believe, grandfather pioneered at Giant Eagle is something that she would welcome. Um, so we recommend in our report that Giant Eagle start the shift to a new partnership by agreeing to raise its entry level wages for all workers to $15 an hour, as we document. Um, uh, Costco already pays close to that. Trader Joe's already pays close to that. Target recently announced that it will phase up its um, entry level wage to $15 an hour. In another service industry in Pittsburgh, the healthcare sector, the regional market leader relatively recently, UPMC, announced that it will phase up its entry level wage for all workers at most facilities to $15 an hour. So we call on Giant Eagle to do the same thing in the grocery industry and to begin the process of setting a new industry wide standard that's at that level. If grocery workers in Allegheny County all earn $15 an hour, we estimate this would put $103 million into the pockets of over 7,000 Allegheny County workers. Next slide, please, John. So this shows the kind of increase workers would get at different wage levels in the entire state of Pennsylvania if grocery industry um, established a $15 an hour minimum wage. So 70,000 plus workers would get an increase in wages of close to 50%. If you go into our report, uh, there's information on what the increase would be in each county, and the number of workers who would benefit. Next slide, please. So this slide shows in different ranges how many workers would benefit by county from a $15 an hour minimum wage. Not surprisingly, Allegheny County and the more populous counties of the southeast and south central Pennsylvania would see the largest number of workers benefiting. But in most counties, you'd have at least 150 workers benefiting. Next slide, please. So this is back to the point that Giant Eagle, particularly in the Pittsburgh and Johnstown areas, is the market leader. So it has enough market share to powerfully influence the overall industry-wide wage. So in Pittsburgh and Johnstown, it can help lead the way to a new grocery store $15 an hour uh, minimum wage standard. It also has substantial market share in Cleveland, in Erie, and a smaller amount in Columbus, Ohio. But uh, next slide, please. So the bottom line of our report is it's time for Giant Eagle to stand behind its mission statement that together we improve people's everyday lives and well-being. Um, the path that the company's been on now for 4 decades isn't working for its workers, isn't working for their families, isn't working for Western Pennsylvania. And it may not work all that much longer for Giant Eagle. So it's time to step back and take a new direction forward, restore that partnership, and with that, restore living wages for its workers as a whole.
So one question that comes up often is that, why is this why is this really an issue? You have these workers who are not necessarily earning a living wage, or what we called, earning poverty wages, but they are choosing to have these jobs that are paying, these poverty wages. So whether that's workers at Giant Eagle who are working part time, or whether it's those workers at Giant Eagle who are maybe technically full time employees. Some people are pushing back and saying, well, it's up to them to go and find some kind of supplemental income of their own. It's not on the company to go above and beyond what in Pennsylvania, it's the federal minimum wage. That's also the minimum wage in Pennsylvania. Or those poverty wages. So how would you respond to that, Steve?
Part of the challenge here is there are too many jobs in too many sectors that don't support a family. So there isn't really a choice for all of the workers to go get a family supporting job. They're continuing to work at Giant Eagle because that's the job they can get. And so the basic challenge of an economy that's extremely productive and with incomes increasing very, very rapidly at the top end, but with prosperity not broadly shared, in the end, the only way to address that problem is by improving some of the jobs that don't support a family, like the ones at Giant Eagle. And again, a particular reason it makes sense to push on the company to take its responsibility in this respect and provide living wage jobs is because it's not just workers that are paying the price for these low wages. It's also taxpayers. They're footing the bill for over 3,000 Giant Eagle workers to get health care or food assistance. So, the only way we'll ever get in the Pittsburgh region enough middle class jobs is if companies such as a Giant Eagle form more of a partnership with their workers and pay better.
Can you also talk a little bit more, Steve, about some of the competitors, some of Giant Eagle's market competitors, whether that's a Costco, a Target, Amazon, as you mentioned, recently bought Whole Foods. Can you talk in a little more detail about how they're looking at, either moving or have already moved to $15 an hour pay, and maybe what the corporate business sense is in doing something like that? Because beyond just it's the right thing, does it also make economic sense for those companies? We heard from many Giant Eagle workers when we were in Pittsburgh to release this report, and many of them said they can't even afford to shop at the stores that they work. And it seems to me this would be sort of the Henry Ford model of thinking about paying workers, where you want your workers to be able to also be your customers. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
You're right. I mean, the current situation has probably a number of Giant Eagle workers, having to shop themselves at discount chains because they can't afford groceries from Giant Eagle. But I think there are two larger points. One is the fact that there are Costco's or Trader Joe's. So in the retail food industry, and Trader Joe's is a grocery store. Costco's is a discount chain that sells groceries, like Walmart. But the examples of Costco and Trader Joe's sort of demonstrate that um, you don't have to compete paying a poverty wage in this industry. I mean, the reason um, operations management researcher Zeynep Tone wrote the book Good Job Strategy focused on food retail was because she knew the prevailing conventional wisdom was that, you know, if you're in this kind of industry, if you're in the grocery or convenience store industry, you have to pay really poorly. And her point was, no, that's wrong. There's a series of companies, three of them in the U.S. One in the one that she picked was in Spain, but that sort of demonstrate that no, if you have a workforce that's paid better and mostly full time and has flexible assignments, um, and you know, some of those chains also actually have a bit less product variety. So that makes inventory management a lot simpler. But she demonstrated they do a series of different things that, again, enable them to pay, typically 40% higher than the industry average wages and benefits. And they're also very profitable companies. Trader Joe's is also a family owned company, just like Giant Eagle is. Um, so again, the first point then is that none of these chains is exactly like Giant Eagle, but several of these chains compete with Giant Eagle, as does to some extent Target, as does to some extent Sheets, which is another uh, good jobs employer in Pennsylvania, actually based in Altoona. So the first point is the bad job strategy that Giant Eagle has um, drifted towards is not the only choice. But the second point is that going forward, again, it may not work, this kind of bad job strategy, because the grocery industry is surprisingly dynamic. Um, we've got Amazon coming in now, having bought Whole Foods. There's a blurring of the line between takeout food and supermarkets. There's an expectation that there'll be more home delivery of groceries in general. Um, so, uh, confronting those kinds of competitive challenges, uh, Giant Eagle more than ever needs a workforce that's um, committed to the company and willing to be flexible. And uh, so riding the storms of a highly competitive industry going forward, um, it's hard to see how, with the current worker satisfaction ratings that um, we showed you, that Giant Eagle can weather those storms. With the current relationship, it needs a partnership again.
So my last question, we heard from a lot of folks who said basically in today's economy, even though decades ago these jobs that we're talking about certainly were family sustaining jobs, not just at Giant Eagle, but across the industry. But that in today's economy, they are not meant to be or shouldn't be family sustaining jobs. That we live in a world now where folks should feel inclined to go pursue post-secondary education in some way, and find a job in the new economy that can be family sustaining. How do you respond to that notion that we should just think of these jobs as no longer family sustaining jobs?
Again, it's a numbers game. I mean, there are some jobs that require a college education and pay decently, but we also have lots of college educated workers now working at Starbucks. There aren't, so because there are too many very large service industries, think janitorial, think the lower end of healthcare, think the lower end of education, whether it's contingent faculty in higher education or support personnel in schools, uh, retail as a whole, not just the retail food industry, the warehouse industry. I mean, there's too many service industries that have too many jobs that don't support a family. So um, the only way we're going to get back to an economy with a fair day's pay for a fair day's work um, is is if some of these giant service industries end up paying better. And in the end, we talked about the need to raise industry-wide standards. In the end, some combination of a much higher minimum wage and Giant Eagle setting a standard that then other companies that it competes with have to try to meet in order to attract and retain a good workforce themselves. Um, what that does really is doesn't it takes it moves towards a situation where you're taking wages and benefits out of competition. So we've which again the Pittsburgh region can do, because if you find a way to get to an industry-wide $15 an hour wage led by Giant Eagle, then no one's disadvantaged. Um, Everyone's paying better. Um, Across the industry, you would actually see a reduction in turnover, and you'd have this situation again where you don't have such a severe shortage of jobs that support a family. If we want that kind of uh, economy that works for all, which again I think people in Western Pennsylvania have really wanted that back for most of the last 40 years, then the way we have to get there is uh, industry leaders in large industries that account for lots of jobs, like Giant Eagle, like UPMC. They have to be part of the solution around enough middle class jobs to go around.